Let's talk about character world building versus storytelling. You've probably seen advice to stop obsessing over world building and start storytelling. I agree completely, but I find that a lot of people who try and switch from world building to storytelling get stuck at world building their characters. And I thought we could talk about that. Let me give you an example. You've got a really cool fantasy environment and it's time to tell some stories, and that means you're going to have to put in some characters because that's how you're going to tell your stories. So we'll start with the bad guy, the evil king of the Red Isle. He's got a flaming sword of flaminess. He's got tons of fire powers because every morning for breakfast he eats demon hearts marinated in puppy blood. He's going to conquer the world, and he hates the main character specifically because that's super convenient. Alternately, how about the good guy's side? Your third party member is Bob. Bob has a hard time controlling his magic. When he was young, he accidentally blew up his family, and then a good wizard tried to teach him how to control his magic, but Bob accidentally blew him up too. Then an evil wizard tried to take advantage of him, but Bob blew him up on purpose. But not before Bob was cursed to wander the land in torment forever, which Bob accepts because Bob thinks Bob deserves it. So tragic. So tragic. The player will cry when Bob narrates the story to them at hour 25. It's almost as tragic as the other 9 party members, all of whom have ineffably tragic backstories that they'll narrate mid-game. These characters have been world built, but not story told. When the player shows up to play your game, they don't want a list of characters with tragic backstories, they want an experience. They're here to have an experience. They want you to tell them a story. We can see how this story might end up working. The pieces are all in place, there's a scaffold of how these things will click together, but we haven't actually built the story yet. We haven't actually told any story. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't plan out your characters. I'm a big fan of knowing the roles of your characters within your story, but it's important to understand that this is not really storytelling. It's still very close to just being world building. The simple truth is that storytelling is its own set of skills. If you are good at storytelling, you will tell good stories. If you are bad at storytelling, you will tell bad stories. And this is completely separate from how carefully you've scaffolded everything out. A good storyteller can tell an amazing story in an empty world with 2 undefined characters. A poor storyteller will not be able to tell a good story even if they are in the most amazing world ever devised. Storytelling is its own set of skills. And the whole point of the advice to stop obsessing over world building and start telling stories is to get you working on those skills, because those skills are usually woefully underpowered. We're pretty addicted to world building, and we're getting good at world building, but none of that actually translates to storytelling. So, obviously, you should know who your characters are, you should know what kind of story you're going to tell, but you still have to actually tell the story. That's the focus, right? Here's my problem. A lot of the techniques we use to build the world and the characters are techniques we inherit from other forms of media, and they are completely inapplicable to what we are trying to do. If we're an indie dev trying to make a small game of our own, we might do our world building and our character building as if it were a tabletop RPG, or as if it were a large CRPG with a team of 50, or as if it were a movie. And these are things that will end up causing us an enormous amount of pain, because those best practices are only best practices in that one kind of media. They exist for a reason. In the case of large CRPGs, the reason that they're structured the way they are is because the production is so chaotic. The story doesn't get cemented until the very end of the process. So you need to build your story so that you can click it together as easily and rapidly as possible. So you scaffold very carefully so that you can see exactly where the story is going to go, so that you can go click, 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 click right at the end and stick it all together. And the same is true of tabletop RPGs. As the module writer, you're not the one actively telling the story. You can try and advise the GM as to how they should tell the story, but your biggest role is to make sure the GM understands the structure of the story so that they can tell it without stumbling over themselves too much. Again, at the very end, click, 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 put it together as rapidly as possible. These are tools to help to make sure that a story can be told in a chaotic, highly time-pressured environment. They are not tools to tell the best story possible. This is really important to understand. Let me give you an example. Oh, look, it's Bob. Hey, Bob. Still crying? Yeah, okay. Bob narrates his sad story to the player in the mid-game, and you do some kind of mission to resolve it, whatever. Why is this the norm? Why does every character in every RPG now have to have a tragic backstory? Is it because tragic backstories make the characters better or more compelling? No, not at all. You want to know what makes characters better and more compelling? Being able to tell a good story. The storytelling techniques you might use to make a character compelling or interesting really are live techniques. They happen right there as the story is unfolding. They're not world-building techniques. You can't world build a compelling character. So why is every character tragic? What's up with that? Well, the answer is, this is its own self-contained little box of tragedy. It doesn't matter how the rest of the game unfolds. If the dev team decides that this is not a volcano anymore, it's now a desert, that's okay. Bob can still tell his tragic backstories. If they decide that rather than fighting a dragon in this stage, you're going to fight a knight, that's okay. Bob can still narrate his tragic backstory. Whatever happens in the chaotic dev environment, we have this box of tragedy that we can just stick in wherever we need a little bit more pathos. It's a little Christmas present full of pain, just for all of us who want to tell a better story, right? So this technique works great if your focus is on the fact that you are in an environment where you are not going to be able to integrate the pathos directly into the story because the story is too chaotic and complicated. So the reason that we see tragic backstories so frequently is because in an environment where you cannot design your story and stick to it, it makes sense to package up all of your highly emotional moments into their own little self-contained beats so that you can just stick them in wherever you need them, no matter what happens to the rest of the story. But this is fundamentally not a very good way to tell the story. Ideally, you want your story to actually integrate all of this emotional stuff. You want the story to be about these characters, and all of their emotions need to build up the story and vice versa. So I'm not telling you that tragic backstories are bad. I'm just saying that the reason that we see all of this happening all the time is because it's a way to allow you to slot in some pathos wherever you need it. If you are not in that kind of chaotic environment, if you are able to actually make your story without someone looming overhead telling you to do it different, then you don't have to use this approach. You can still have a tragic backstory if that's your thing, but the whole point is that you can actually integrate it into the flow of the story, rather than it being its own thing that gets dropped in whenever you happen to need pathos. This is what I mean when I say that the techniques we often fall back on are not suited for our specific media. If we are trying to, as an indie dev, make a small game, we don't need to rely on this tragic backstory thing because it's just not a technique that benefits us. It actively gets in our way if we try and think this way. The same thing is true almost universally. For almost anything we build, we tend to inherit our world building from other places, and it's not optimal. For example, let's say that there is a demon, and the demon is going to blow up the planet. I'm a demon. Obviously, the player is going to go over and sword them in the face until they stop being a demon, as you do. So this is a pretty typical approach. Here's my question. How is the demon integrated into the player character's flow? How does this story make the player character care? Now, chances are that you have world built this demon. The demon is sucking up all of the ether in the area, which means all the crops will die. It's just horrible, right? But that's got nothing to do with the player character. It's got nothing to do with the story that the player is being told. That's something that matters to the world, not to the player. And because of this, a lot of storytellers will try desperately to make this character matter by just using brute force. Like, oh look, there's a dead puppy and a dead cat, and the guy is killing off all the puppies and kittens. You care now, right? Or the demon will say, oh, I love killing children. Killing children is my favorite thing. And the player is supposed to think, oh, they're very bad. And if you really need to make an impact, one of the random NPCs that the player knows will just show up to get killed. So the player will care. And this is the norm, right? If you've ever played a video game, you've seen this bad guy. In fact, you've probably seen sequences of this bad guy, because every time you kill off one of these dudes, the next one comes by, and they're twice as powerful and twice as evil. And then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It's just a parade of, villains of the week. This approach doesn't help us tell stories. Even if we are very careful to do the world building around these demons, oh, this demon is an Azazel demon that does this kind of magic and will do this in the end, and it really matters to the world because this will happen, and then that will matter, and then this nation opposes that, and then... But none of that is actually going to be easy to reflect in the storytelling. None of that is going to be easy to connect to the player, which means that if you do that kind of world building, you're going to end up having to do a lot of legwork to try and connect the player to these plot elements. You're going to have to introduce new characters that care about what's going on, and then get the player to care about those characters so that you can commutatively care about what's going on. And that comes from using the wrong kind of world building. We're using world building that is not really very good for these kinds of personal stories. This is why it's so critical to really understand what kind of story you're telling, and not to get off in the weeds with your world building, because you're probably building the wrong kind of world. Now, all of this isn't to say that you should just blindly storytell. To be honest, you can probably blindly storytell. It'll be fine. You'll at the very least learn more about storytelling. But I do understand that if you blindly storytell, you can easily write yourself into corners, and you'll have to do an ass pull to try and get yourself out. And that's frequently what happens with this kind of environment, where you're just rolling along and you have suddenly run out of plot and you've got to do something. And it's like every single comic, boys comic, I forget what they're called, shonen comic, right? Like Dragon Ball and all of them, right? There'll be a dozen or so chapters that are really good, and the player and the main character, the avatar, will be learning and growing and having fun, and there's a lot of interesting things going on, and then the arc will end, and it's very clear that the authors ran out of ideas because they just desperately search for something that character can care about. And that will inevitably be some guy in a cloak giggling like a hyena while they talk about how cool it is to murder people and how they are going to murder everything that this character cares about, because that will at the very least make the character care about this giggling hyena. But this isn't structurally going to tell a very good story. They've written themselves into a corner because their story ended before they thought it would, or they had to continue it past where they thought they had to continue it. And as a result, they're struggling to try and figure out some way to continue. And in this sort of situation, world building would be very helpful. Building correctly, understanding how you're world building to support the story you're trying to tell. Creating a scaffold that will unfold well for your kind of story. But until you've tried to tell your kind of story, you don't know what kind of world building you need and what kind of scaffolding will work. So tell stories. That is the point. You need to actually tell stories. Okay? That's it. Let me know what you think.